This autumn, I will be on a tour of North America and parts of Western Europe, talking about my latest book, The Genetic Book of the Dead, A Darwinian Reverie. I will be joined on stage by a range of friends and foes. The book is aimed at the same audience as The Selfish Gene, but the content is quite different. Beginning on September the 4th, I'll be visiting Dallas, Austin, Newark, Washington, Boston, Minneapolis, Milwaukee, probably San Diego and Los Angeles, then San Francisco, Portland, and Vancouver. Then, returning across the Atlantic in October, I have events in Oxford, Coventry, London, Cambridge, Glasgow, Salford, Antwerp, Amsterdam, Dublin, and Belfast. The events will include a Q&A and a limited meet and greet. You can get your tickets at richarddawkinstour.com. I have long wanted to meet John McWhorter. He's an extremely well-known public intellectual and opinion leader who, in my opinion, always talks sense. I have this rather eccentric idea that before becoming a public intellectual, you need to earn your credentials by having something important and interesting to be intellectual about. And John McWhorter qualifies in a big way. He is a world authority on linguistics, the study of the extraordinary phenomenon of human language, which I think is one of the most important and interesting subjects out there. We both spoke at the Dissident Dialogues conference in New York this year, and I seized the opportunity to invite him onto the Poetry of Reality. I was delighted and honored when he accepted. I began by asking him about linguistics, including the vexed question of the origin of language. Only later did we move on to his more controversial book, a book that I strongly recommend, Woke Racism, How a New Religion Has Betrayed Black America. Well, John McWhorter, it's such a pleasure to meet you at last. I've longed to meet you for a long time, and it's an honor. It's a great pleasure.
You have always been a hero of mine.
I'd like to talk about linguistics, at least first.
Good.
To be a linguist is two different things. It's to be an expert at speaking languages, which of course you are, but you're also a linguist in a more interesting sense, which is you're a scholar of, of academic linguistics.
Yeah.
Could I ask what drew you to that in the first place?
Well, it's not what most linguists were drawn by. I am both of those kinds of linguists. And actually, academic linguists don't think of people who are good at learning languages as the same thing. In our minds, there's practically a different word for it. But that old-fashioned sense of linguist, I heard a little girl speaking Hebrew when I was 5. And I had a very monolingual childhood, English. There were no Latino people in the neighborhood. Didn't hear anything else. Didn't know there was a such thing as another language. And all of a sudden, her parents walked in, and I couldn't understand what she was saying. And it felt, I didn't know what a stroke was, but it felt like what I would now think of as having some sort of emergency. And then I realized, no, they're talking, but it's just that I can't understand. And I know that normal people would have heard that and thought, oh, and just moved on. I've noticed as I've gotten older that the presence of other languages for people who are not weird isn't particularly interesting. They just figure, I don't know what they're saying and I'm going to move on. For me, I thought, I want to know what she's saying. I feel left out. I want to be able to speak in two ways. And it wasn't a cultural thing. I didn't know what Hebrew, Jewish, Israeli were. I asked my mother, what are they doing? Why can't I understand? And my mother walked over and asked them what they were speaking. They said, we're speaking Hebrew. Mom came back over and she said, they're speaking Hebrew. And I said, what's a Hebrew? And she said, it's another language. And I said, why can't we do that? And she said, because we're not Jewish. I didn't know what it meant, but I felt left out. And I have that to this day. Any language I hear, I think, what is it? And I would like to play with that. That kind of person, and you can call it a linguist, in the words of the late, great John O'Hala, a linguist older than me. A linguist might not like linguistics, and very often linguists don't. And a linguist very often is monolingual or maybe only knows one other language and couldn't care less about others. So there's a small overlap. I happen to be both of those things. And I'm not sure my being a linguist really helps my linguistics. They're just two different things. One thing is a hobby. The other thing is an academic pursuit.
I could imagine that being fluent in a different language, that does give you quite a lot of insight in being a linguist. Being a linguist must actually help towards being a linguist?
It helps a little because languages differ from one another. And when you wrap your head around the other ones, it gives you a sense of the things your language doesn't do and the things that theirs does do. And that's especially important with English because it's hard for us to know it from within our own heads. But English is a rather telegraphic language as languages go. Some languages are extremely telegraphic. Some languages pack so much semantic nuance into every sentence that you wonder what the point is. English is really somewhere in between. So to speak another language is to see that a language might divide things into arbitrary genders, that a language might have something like a subjunctive where you have to mark the hypothetical in a way that English barely does. So it helps, especially I think from English, but from any language, just to see how the other ones work might pour into your sense of what you want to study linguistically.
As an evolutionary biologist, I think the origin of language is a really, really salient event in the history of life.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, comparable to the origin of the eukaryotic cell. I mean, a really big thing.
Yeah.
So I'd like to talk about that, if I may, for a bit. Do you think it only happened once?
I do. I'm not as dogmatic about that as I used to be, but my intuition is that language would have happened among what would then have been a small band of humans, maybe even hominids, depending on where you draw the line, and that then offshoot groups always had this thing called language, and it developed into many different versions of the same thing. The cool idea among what are called the generativists, the ones who were sparked by Noam Chomsky's work and now are a whole school of thought, is that all languages seem to be based on the same basic patterns. To be honest, the idea that there's a universal grammar, there are many brilliant people working on it. I'm not sure I have seen that bear fruit in any way that I, in an unbiased way, can see. I'm not sure what they say the universals are after all this time. Nevertheless, even if languages have spread apart from one another enough that there's no universal grammar, the emergence of this strange thing where you can talk about things that are not around, where you have labels for things rather than one thing. So not that you call that one rose a name, but that you can talk about roses, and then getting into words for already and words for nevertheless. That strikes me as something so improbable that it would have begun, but I think it's more parsimonious to suppose that it happened once and that everything is descended from it, just like the eukaryotic cell. I don't think it's the idea that that happened many times, or maybe some people would say, but I'll bet you would say that it happened once and it was a fortuitous thing where the organelles came back together. And
maybe twice because of chloroplasts as well as...
Oh, because they're different. That's right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But only those two.
Yes.
Yeah.
To me, the big thing about human language as opposed to animal communication is hierarchically nested, embedded grammar.
Mm-hmm.
The sort of relative clauses, prepositional clauses, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that could have been a single step event.
Recursion.
Recursion could have been a single step event. If you think about computer languages, the early languages that I learned, like Fortran, couldn't do it. And then later languages can do recursion. And it's a one-step event. I mean, a language either can do recursion or it can't. And so that, although I'm a gradualist in evolution generally, rather, almost dogmatically so.
This would have been a punctuated.
This is the one place where I might actually depart from that. I think perhaps it was a one-step event.
Yeah.
The invention of recursion.
Maybe, Richard, but I mean, there's fierce fighting about this. The idea that recursion is the heart of what distinguishes human language.
Okay.
But again and again, it's found that there are possible precursors in it, if I may call it a precursor, in animals that are elsewhere on the scale, so to speak, than us. And so you can see recursion in bird song. I've seen an analysis of it in whale cries. And of course, the question is, what is being communicated with this recursion? Maybe we could say that human language's recursion just piggybacks on something that at first wasn't about meaning.
Not everybody will know what recursion is. Perhaps you could...
Exactly what you mentioned before.
Yeah.
So the fact that you can say the man who I saw yesterday went down the steps. The who I saw yesterday is kind of like a sentence within a sentence.
Yeah.
I told the woman that I had seen a hippopotamus talking. That is in itself another sentence. And so it's not only about the embedding, but the fact that you have one main sentence and then you have another one that's kind of subordinated
and you
to
can
that
stick
sentence.
it in the middle rather than sticking it on the end.
And you can stick it in the middle,
yes.
Or even if you hang it on the end. I told the woman, that's the main sentence. And then that I saw a hippopotamus speaking last night. It's subordinate to what the main or matrix clause is, as we call it. And that's something that people have often said was the heart of what human language is. Now, the problem is, and I'm not just doing this to be contrary, because I like the idea that there was this magic thing that maybe happened once and that it was so useful to communication that all humans have it. There are languages that seem not to have recursion. So they wouldn't say the man who I saw yesterday went down the steps. They'd say a man went down the steps. I saw it yesterday. And there's a good argument that there are languages that don't have that. And there's some linguists that don't want to hear it, but frankly, it's not just one language. Like the linguist Daniel Everett documented it in a language called Piraha in the Amazonian forest. There are many languages that really don't recurse. Now, you might say that it's genetically specified, but then it's suppressed in some languages, kind of like the back legs of a whale or something like that. But it could be that there are just many different ways of being a language. Some of them recurse, so to speak, and some of them don't. There is great controversy about that right now, and I'm not sure where I fall in it, but I'm just giving you a sense of the lay of the land.
I didn't know there were some languages that didn't recurse. That's interesting to me. Is it possible that recursion arose prior to language, that somehow thought processes, working things out logically, working things out, what should I do next? What should be my best strategy for getting a
If I this,
food?
then
if I do
that.
this, then I do that.
Right.
Could that have happened before language?
Yeah. Because isn't it clear that many apes and possibly even crows seem to be doing it in the way they reason things out? Crows seem to have an if-then in terms of the way they can work things out and the way different groups of crows do things in different ways. Crow culture, I think that overexpands the word culture. But yeah, recursion certainly wouldn't have started with human language, but human language would have brought it into a usage that enabled us to take over and destroy the planet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, what about FOXP2? Because I've never been quite clear what it is that the mutants can't do. You better fill our listeners in on that one.
Yeah, that really, I so wish it was like 1987 and I could say, well, we found the language gene. Yeah. And no linguist really thought that, but it was closer to truth then than it's turned out to be. FOXP2 has turned out to be a major disappointment. And so the original story, and it was such a good story, is that they find this family in England and everybody whose FOXP2 gene is a little out of whack is unusually inarticulate, but it's only about speech and it's not about their general cognitive ability. One, it's been found that it was more than speech, that people like that were cognitively somewhat different as well. And so chicken or egg. And two, FOXP2, we know more now, as if I'm a geneticist, but FOXP2, as we know now, is not about language in the sense that we might think. It has something to do with the musculature that we use to produce it, but it has something to do with other muscles. And no one has found evidence that FOXP2 has anything to do with what's going on in what's usually the left temporal lobe of the brain. And that's what the language gene would be. And so it's increasingly clear that human language, the ability to learn it, is clearly genetically specified. There's a reason why only we do it. But not only is it not one thing, but let me put it a different way. It is in many regions of the brain and therefore almost by definition couldn't be one thing. And even if somehow it could be, because you do gene switches, et cetera, and it has various effects in various places, FOXP2 is not that.
Okay, well, that's a disappointment.
It is. I know that was fun at the time.
I was rather keen on that as well. Never mind. Let's move on. Let's move on to the families of languages and Indo-European. I've always been a bit baffled by why it's assumed that Indo-Europeans, although you can derive a lot of European and Indian languages from it, why would you assume that it was spoken by one tribe in one place? Does it necessarily follow that it would have to be the Proto-Indo-European would have been spoken by one people?
Depends on what you call a people. And it's interesting, new data has come in about this like 10 minutes ago. But Indo-European it's kind of like English gives you a sense of language as frankly easier than it is. Indo-European can give you a sense that language families are cozier and more obvious in terms of their relationships than one might think. It's a newish family, and all Indo-European languages, if you know how to clear away the cobwebs, are extremely alike in certain ways that have to be due to some one initial ancestor. Now, was that ancestor maybe spoken by 3 or 4 different groups? Probably, but one would assume that that was about some kind of spread and that originally it would have been one thing. And I guess the analogy would be that, you can look at, Chasmosaurus and Triceratops and Montanoceratops and Leptoceratops and Psittacosaurus. Those were all very different things, but it's clear that originally there was some Psittacosaurus-like thing that all of those things came from.
Yes.
Because they're so alike. And so Proto-Indo-European would have been the Psittacosaurus.
Yeah, but the difference is that all those sauruses, once they split apart, they don't come together again, whereas languages do. And
that is so true.
That's
what makes it harder.
Well, an anecdote, I once attended a conference, actually was part organizer of a conference on linguists and biologists together.
That must have been fun.
A group of Russian linguists there.
That's even more fun.
Yes. And I stood up in my naivety and said that there was a big difference between biological evolution and linguistic evolution in that, for example, English is clearly a hybrid language.
Yes.
So it's not as a Germanic language.
Right.
So I said, but what percentage of English words are of Romance origin? They said about 80%. So I said, well, in what sense is it a Germanic language then? And I just kind of kicked around the room about that. But okay, let me put it to you. In what sense is English a Germanic language?
I can so see all of that. Yeah. Different schools of thought create different senses of how things are. But English is a very mixed language. And so most of the words that we are using, well, let me not exaggerate it. Over half of the words that we're using right now do not come from English originally. So there's so much Norse. There is so much, in particular, French and Latin and a smidgen of Dutch. And so we have a really mongrel vocabulary to the point that German is harder for us than it should be. Old English is much harder for us than it should be because we've really become a brand new language. And then also, and it depends on when that conference was, but I'll bet, God bless the Russian linguists, I doubt if they've gotten onto this yet. English grammar is so mixed with Celtic grammar that there are people who, pushing it too hard, say that basically English is a Celtic language with a lot of other words. That's taking it too far, but we are very much a bastard tongue, as I used as the title of one of my books. That can't be denied. Now, it's clear that English did begin as Old English, which was not significantly mixed, but things happened to English, and that's what happens to many languages. In Indo-European, that looks kind of exotic because the languages are relatively new and they spread out all over Europe, and they're kind of sitting there, and then they get standardized and they look less mixed than they are. With most other language families in the world, you're waiting to reconstruct this tidy Proto-Indo-European equivalent, but it's hard because not only are there many languages, but they've all been mixing all the time. And so you're trying to figure out who belongs to who. And then, of course, families mix together as well. So around the world, it is generally much harder to come to a pretty picture than it is in Europe, where linguistics happen to have begun. So finding a family tree equivalent to the way you could write your book, The Ancestor's Tale, might be impossible, or it's going to take a whole lot longer than it would have by using, say, genes, which is what you have the advantage.
Okay, Anglo-Saxon was spoken here in these, not here, in Britain, in England.
Yeah.
And then other languages came in, and that is one justification for saying that Anglo-Saxon is the sort of primitive starting point, and then the other things came in. But you could say, well, it's Norman French. And then it just happened that they invaded. But nevertheless, why don't you say that English is a Norman French language with an admixture of Anglo-Saxon? Is it just pure geography, or is there a better reason than that?
There's a better reason. And that's the sort of thing where there are some linguists who would say, oh, shut up. But no, there are people who have proposed weirder things. There are a group of trained linguists, well, two, who actually think that we are now speaking Old Norse and that the English words are just mixed in. And they're not insane. You have to really look at every point. The reason is this. From the outside, languages look like they're all about words. But what the heart of language is, what you control most subconsciously and what tends to be especially preserved over time is the grammar. And so despite how much has happened to English, the basic game plan here is much more like Dutch than it's like French. And so what's plausible in terms of both the written documentation, but it gets to the point where with languages you can even guess, is that the Anglo-Saxon grammar with the Anglo-Saxon words came in. Many of the words were replaced, but the grammar stayed the same, the underlying computer code. And so that's why we can know that we're not speaking French, we're speaking English. So the little words, all of the thes and the and, the fact that we have, on the ED past tense, that's very Germanic. Any Germanic language has something that's kind of like that. The fact that we would say, well, Hermione actually is black, said Harry. That said Harry. That's a remnant in English of something that the other Germanic languages do all the time with changing the order of the noun and the verb. There's no explanation but that. So we are speaking Anglo-Saxon, but with a huge mixture of words and also an enormous mixture of grammatical patterns, especially from Celtic and some from Norse. And that's what happens to languages. More to English than the other Germanic languages, but that's what happens to a language.
Okay.
That was more detail than we needed, but that's the reason.
Yeah. Okay. I see that. It's not obvious. I mean, knowing a smattering of German and a smattering of French, it's not clear to me that English grammar is more Germanic than French. But I mean, for example,
very quickly, if we couldn't see English changing on paper, it would be a less intuitive case. Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. Right. Moving up to the more recently to dialects, and by the way, I loved your I listened to your I forget which book it was, one of your books.
Say Our Magnificent Bastard.
I've read Our Magnificent Bastard Language and Story of Human Language as well.
Good.
And the Story of Human Languages is a series of lectures.
Yeah.
Yes. Were they in front of an audience, or were they in a studio?
Those were in a studio. Some of the lectures were to 3 audience plants that they put in because they thought that people like to go speak in front of an audience. About halfway through, I said, I don't need that. I can just pretend that they're people. So some of them are with people, some of them are, and then they fake the audience response.
I have applause.
Plus, there was never that many people in the room.
Okay. And I love the way you sort of dropped into French accent and there is British accents as well. It's really clever.
Bad British accents.
It's very, very
I apologize.
I love that. I have a theory I want to try out on you on the difference between a dialect and a language.
Oh, this is hard. All right.
Okay. And this comes really from evolutionary biology. Of course, as you know, when speciation happens, there's a sort of interregnum.
Yeah.
When they haven't quite diverged enough to be called separate species.
Yeah.
And in that interregnum, there's a time when natural selection favors exaggerating the difference between the various species. There's a pair of...
Why?
Well, because hybridization is bad. Hybridization is a genetically bad thing. So, there's a pair of grasshoppers in North America, for example, genus Cortippus. And, I forget which is which, but on the west side and on the east side of the United States, there are different, species.
Mm-hmm.
And, but they can hybridize.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not quite separate species yet.
Mm-hmm.
And, the difference in their song is one of pitch. And as you get into the zone of overlap in the middle of the United States, the pitches diverge. So in the zones of separation,
I get why this would be right.
Okay,
all right. Yeah,
you get why that should be. So there is natural selection in favor of separating them out in the zone of overlap. Well, now, let's take dialects of British English.
Yeah.
I could try my hand at imitating somebody from Glasgow.
Mm-hmm.
But if I did that, if I went into a Glasgow pub and started trying to talk like them, I probably
you don't sound exactly.
I'd get thumped. I mean,
right.
And so it seems to me, if you take something like the Scandinavian languages, which, as you say, they're all one language.
Yeah, and they know it. Yeah.
Is there a tendency? Could one define a dialect as that which, if you try to imitate it, it will arise hostility? Whereas a language, if I go to Holland,
right,
and try to speak Dutch, they would be very pleased and they would welcome it. They would,
or they wouldn't be mad at you.
On the contrary, they would say, "Whoa, you're trying to speak Dutch. That's wonderful."
Yeah.
Whereas if I go to Scotland and try to speak Scottish English, I would be treated with hostility. So that there's a zone, as you get a divergence between dialects, as they drift apart, they go through a time when to attempt to imitate it would be around hostility. And then we get beyond that barrier, when you push through that barrier and you reach a zone of friendliness.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's my contribution to linguistic theory.
It's like somebody saying, "You're talking like us."
Yes.
Or "You're speaking our language," as opposed to "Don't make fun of us."
Exactly. Spot on.
Richard,
Yep.
that's so good, but we would have to stop using our words because, for example, Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish are considered separate languages.
Yes.
If you waved a magic wand, they'd be considered dialects of the same thing. So in this world, it wouldn't work because I'm pretty sure that if a Swede goes and imitates a Norwegian, it's a little tense. You're not supposed to do that. And yet they're supposed to be different languages. But I take your point. There would be this magic point at which, and so, for example, would there still be in-between zones? And so Jamaican patois can get to the point that it really stretches the boundary of what English is. Now, if I put on a Jamaican accent in Kingston, I don't know if anybody's going to hit me, but I'm not going to be invited back. If I start imitating deep Jamaican patois, which is practically a different language, I can imagine they would find that admirable. You're trying to speak our language. So there'd be that fuzzy zone.
Okay, well, that bears out my point then.
Yeah. And so the words don't match. And so Jamaican dialect, etc. Jamaican patois, you could say that's another language. You could say that's a reason to say that it's a different language. Yeah, I get that.
Okay.
Yeah, but we'd have to come up with two new words other than language and dialect.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. What else have I got here? You've dealt with, in one of your books, you dealt with the possibility that language started in the great sort of cultural flowering of 50,000 or 45,000 years ago when you start getting statues and musicalist flutes and things like that.
Flutes, yeah.
But I think you think it's older than that.
That's gone. That's gone. That was a bizarre idea. It's what I was kind of raised on. The idea that there's a big bang in Europe, say 50,000 years ago, and that language came from that. That never made any sense because, okay, let's say that these people in what's now Spain started talking. What about all the people who it was known, even when people were talking about this, that people had spread almost all over the world by that time. And so there are no Native Americans in North and South America, but there are people in
Australia.
And there are people in Australia. And so how did language spread to them? And what amazes me is that the people who were talking about this Big Bang were some of the smartest people in the world. And yet, to my knowledge, they never answered that question. And this is not me because I'm black doing a kind of dog whistle and saying that they were racist. I have no reason to think so. But it was a very flabby idea that language emerged in Europe. And as it's become ever clearer that that mental sophistication and at least creativity traces to Southern Africa and the Blombus Cave. And I think that it's now 80,000 years ago that we can see sophistication. And now we've gone even further back, actually, 380,000 years ago, somewhere in between those two dates, 380 and 500. You can see what's probably some kind of Homo habilis with corners that they've made from wood. It's the sort of thing that always decays. But if their carpentry was that sophisticated, probably they were talking too. And so it's gone to the point that the old idea that Homo sapiens is about 300,000 years old and then speech maybe happens even 80,000 years ago, I don't think it works. Daniel Everett has convinced me, and it's the kind of thing I didn't want to believe because you don't like novelty, especially as you get, past about 40. But he argues that Homo erectus, which is much older than Homo sapiens, must have had language too, because Homo erectus, for example, crossed large pieces of ocean down in what is now Indonesia. You would have had to plan to do it. And he makes the argument that there are all sorts of cultures living today, hunter-gatherer cultures, where once they were gone, you'd have no evidence that they were as mentally sophisticated as we are. He thinks that speech goes back about 1.8 million years. And I have, over the past couple years, started choking and saying that in public because I think he's right. The first languages would have been then.
So you think Homo erectus could speak?
Homo erectus could speak. And some people say, well, probably not as well as us. And I'm not sure if we have the wherewithal to say that. If you're going to cross all that water, and you can see two places where they did that, you weren't just grunting. You had to put together the boats. You had to explain what the point of this was. It suggests that they were talking creatures. And so I think language is not just 80,000 years old. I think that it's a good 1.8 million. It's not as easy a story because now...
Not everybody would agree that you need language to build a boat, though, would they?
Cross an ocean? To cross a very large body of water in order to forge a new life. How would you communicate that this was what you were going to do? How would you communicate the displacement? Why are we going to get in this boat? And you have to be able to say, there are too many people here. We don't like them. Over there, you get the feeling that they have fruits or something. And you have to then create consensus, and then you have to get in the boat. That seems to me that they had a way of communicating on a level beyond even a brilliant ape. No?
Well, if you look at the distribution of animals generally, I mean, islands get colonized by
accident.
I mean, yeah. Floating driftwood, floating mangrove plants.
So it would have been people too, where just tsunami
I think it's a bit of a stretch to say that because they crossed the ocean, they have language because, we have, I mean, monkeys got to South America, and I'm not quite sure, when in the continental drift that would have happened, but I think you've got to get used to the idea that, this kind of thing only has to happen once.
The monkeys that get to Africa.
Well, in the West Indies.
And lots of animals do this.
Yes. I mean, iguanas in West Indian islands, have been actually documented, drifting across on, trees that get uprooted by hurricanes. So I think you need to make a stronger case anyway than just they managed to cross the ocean. So they must have.
Dan Everett has one other point. And to be honest, it escapes me what it is, but I'm just going to push back a little bit, out of genuine curiosity. Wouldn't humans have been in more of a position to avoid that happening than animals where a piece of land breaks off and they float over there? I mean, a human knows how to run inland or something like that, whereas animals...
Oh yes, that's true. But these things, it only has to happen once.
And then the people are there.
Yes.
We should do this again and I'll find out more evidence.
Yeah.
Okay. It's his theory, but I was convinced. But I know just what you mean, that a clump of dirt takes these insects to some continent. Yes.
Yes.
That happens.
It does happen. One of the most baffling things to me, going back to the origin of language itself, is the very first words that it's one thing to talk about languages evolving, and of course they do all the time, but just to begin with, and you have no words at all.
It's so hard.
It's really...
It's very hard. And, it's trying to imagine how the first word for tree emerged. It's so mystical that it almost makes you believe in God. You can figure out how family words happened. Mama. That's easy. Yeah. And then the next person, once he goes ta-ta, well, the father's going to think that's what he is.
Yeah.
So that's easy. Maybe you make up cute little nonsense words as names. Maybe that happens. Or something. But how you get the rock and maybe with animals, you get imitation. And there are many people who are really into the sound symbolism of many words like dab or giggle. Good. And all of that is about 1/100th of 1% of words. How do you get yesterday? How do you get day? And that isn't known yet. And one can do statistical modelings to show that once you've got a certain amount of those words, they will grow into others. But how did you get the first punch? I would be really happy to see language evolution specialists come up with that one. That's tough. Grammar is easy. You can see how grammar happened. I'm going to go to the store. Well, it's an evolution of the word go. But how do you get the word for rock? No one knows.
Yes. Let alone the word for existentialism.
Yeah, yes. Exactly. It's tough.
That's really tough. Right. Maybe we better move on to woke racism.
Okay.
However reluctantly. I'm interested in the idea that it's a religion, the elite. Why did you call the book? Why didn't you call the book the elite? You called the book woke. Was that publisher's pressure? Or?
Yes.
Yes. I missed it. Right.
The original title of the book was The Elect, but
I meant elect.
Yeah. That has never caught on, that word. I got it from somebody else, but I thought Joseph Bottom, but I thought that I would popularize it. People don't want that. And so the book, to be honest, has been successful beyond my wildest dreams, but nobody wants to call them the elect. Woke racism was definitely a bunch of guys in a room, quote unquote, except they were not all guys by any means. I think the editor came up with woke racism. I resisted it, at first. And, my girlfriend resisted it because it sounded too mean. And there's a little bit of me now that kind of thinks I didn't mean to call anybody names, but you have to sell your book. And frankly, there is a racism in the way the woke think. It's not deliberate, but it's there. And here we are. Okay.
The elite. Elect.
I think elite is more shiny.
The elect. A dear friend of mine likes everything about it except that for her, a religion has to be supernatural.
Nobody likes that.
And I like it, but she doesn't. And so what is it about the elect that makes it a religion, even though not supernatural? I think I know, but
for me, the religious analogy was heartfelt. I really do feel as if I have seen a religion being born, especially in the 21st century. And of course, it depends on what you call a religion, but where your cognitive processes are expected to be left behind in terms of logic going from A to B. And you're just supposed to have a certain faith. You're supposed to take certain tenets as given regardless of external evidence. That to me is religious thought. I'm amazed by it because I'm an anal kind of person who probably should have been a lawyer. And when I see people willfully...
You're not a lawyer, by the way.
What?
I'm very glad you're not a lawyer.
Sometimes I wonder. But watching people espouse things that really don't cohere, except as according to this philosophy, I find, wow, you have one part of your brain that's sequestered off from this thing called logic. And for me, that is religion. Now, calling it supernatural to an extent, for me, with all due respect to your friend, that's labels. But I think the thing people like least about woke racism is that I keep calling it a religion rather than, although the problem is, what else would I have used, although I wasn't being exploitative? If I say cult, I'm being mean. And also a cult would require more self-consciousness of organization than they have. If I say ideology, not quite, because I'm talking about not having a sense of things based on reality, whereas people can have different senses of how you're going to organize things, which they can argue for carefully. That for me is an ideology. You're going from an ideology, you hang everything from your tree. Whereas a religion is where, frankly, you allow yourself not to make sense at all. And so to see, for example, good, smart white people saying we cannot submit black people to standardized tests. They're racist. And they're going from the fact that black people, for various reasons, often are not as good at them as white and Asian people, to say we should take them away from them. To not understand how condescending that is, to not understand that what you're saying is that black people just aren't as quick on the uptake as us, as opposed to thinking, how do we make black people better on the test? That's religious. It means that you've been taught that which bothers black people must be eliminated. That which can be called racist by a charismatic black person must be eliminated because I must show that I'm not a racist. And no one's thinking this, but regardless of whether I'm actually reasoning from A to B, I see that as an unintentional kind of racism. Defund the police. Now, that's all a little bit 2020, 2021 now. But the fact that anybody would have said defund the police because of what happened to George Floyd in the face of regular calls from disadvantaged black neighborhoods to have more police. And that's an ancient phenomenon that goes back to the 70s. And it was certainly there in 20 and 21. You get a kind of white person who kept saying that with their fist in the air in the face of the black grandmother who lost her nephew to gunfire a week before. It's not a deliberate lack of compassion, but they are subordinating the feelings, the thoroughly legitimate feelings, really opinions of black people who live in a neighborhood to their quest to demonstrate that they are not racist. That's really, talk about supernatural. In order for that to really cohere of a good person, and I think that people like that are good people, it's that you've got a religion. It's the equivalent of you thinking that when you die, you're going to be, living in the grace of somebody who died 2,000 years ago. It's that disconnected from anything that we can actually see and reasonably describe right now. So to me, that's a religion. I literally see it that way. I think some people think it was a marketing ploy, or I just
no. I think it's very convincing.
Yeah.
And there's a very specific analogy to original sin.
Oh yeah.
Well,
definitely.
That's
the privilege. Yeah. And that you can't live it down. None of that. I mean, it's a nice thing to talk about white privilege and to understand what it is. But the idea that you can't live it down and that therefore, because you're a privileged white person, you can't write about other people than yourself. And then if you do write about privileged white people, you're John Cheever and you're a racist, or that your opinion about anything connected to race is not valid because you have the privilege, although you can't specify exactly why it's not valid. And if anybody asks you to specify it, they get smacked in the face. All of that is religion. And yes, so much of it resembles Christianity, including this isn't a safe space. I can't be here. That means that you're saying that somebody's a heretic. It's the same thing that happened to Galileo. It's a different word, but the notion that I don't feel safe. And a lot of people were saying this on Zoom. This person can't work here. I don't feel safe. Well, what do you mean? And what is it that you're worried is going to happen to you, actually? We're not supposed to ask. All of that is religious thought. That's somebody holding, their fingers like this. And so I saw religion coming and I wrote that, but it's embarrassing. I wrote it in like 10 minutes. I was really, really angry. And I had a summer pandemic.
It's a passionate book.
God. I'm getting mad now. Yeah. But yeah, I wrote it because I felt that a lot of people felt the same way and that a lot of them are black. And that has very much turned out to be true.
Yeah. So that point is very well taken. And the point about patronizing is extremely well taken. It's condescending.
That's awful.
Patronizing.
Yeah.
I found it very, very convincing.
Thank you.
And I recommend it to all sorts of people, but then I'm white. So
you're racist, right?
Yeah.
No, actually, that one did exactly its job. It's already becoming obsolete. It's clearly something somebody wrote on their porch in 2020. I think things are different now than they were in terms of peak wokeness back then. I think people have retreated and understood racism exists and that we must expunge it as much as possible, but stop defenestrating people. But something needed to be written then. If my book played any part in the questioning, and honestly, I think it did. I'm glad. And, now we move on. I'll bet it's the only book I'll ever write that will actually get translations. Woke racism is now in what? It's in Portuguese. It's in German. And I think French is coming. That'll be the only book I have that gets translated. But that makes me happy too, because wokeness was beginning to take over the whole world. And I don't think it should. We need to go back to a legitimate 2015 kind of liberal left thinking about race that actually helps people. So now they call them in German, it's the chosen is what they called it. And then in Portuguese, it's just, woke racism. But I'm happy to see that book get around. Yeah.
Good. What else? It's interesting, isn't it, that, being black is something which it behaves like a genetic dominant, even though it isn't. It's a mimetic dominant in the sense that if you have, almost any ancestors, I mean, a great grandfather who's black, then you're called black.
Mm-hmm.
It's not quite a genetic dominant. It's a cultural dominant. But I mean, Barack Obama could just as well call himself white.
Oh yeah.
And yet, you've made the same point yourself. So
it makes no sense.
Yeah.
And it's it is dominant in that even I am not the kind of person who would say that based on, the cheek swab that I'm really half African, that therefore I'm not black. I was born in 1965. There's certain categories and that's it. And I've got other things to think about. I would not say I'm not going to accept the category. But the fact that we now look at, say, somebody who's a quarter black American and say, and therefore they're black, that is going to look so ridiculous in the future. And I think that future is coming ever sooner. But it recapitulates the way bigoted Southerners were thinking like 10 minutes ago.
Yes.
If you've got any black in you, and then you have somebody with a PhD saying you're denying your heritage. What's the heritage? You have to specify. And if you ask the question, everybody's eyes roll. And that's religion. And so, we live under that illusion, and it is quite dominant because I'm stuck in it. Although my kids are, they're half me and they're half their mother. Technically, they qualify as what used to be called mixed. But in the world they're living in, I'm frankly not sure that they are going to embrace a black American identity. I think they're going to think of themselves as just people because they never knew the 20th century and they're growing up affluent in highly racially diverse places. There are already people in my life, and I'm sure people observing my life, who think that my wondering whether my daughters are black is heretical. They're thinking he must not want to be black himself. He doesn't understand the racism that they're going to encounter. But the thing is, if I specify, okay, what's the racism that they're going to encounter in this life? As opposed to, for example, racism I certainly encountered in the 70s and 80s. In this life, how often is it going to be and how direct is it going to be? And if it's going to be something extremely rare, why do you base a whole identity on that? Why? And of course, to put it that directly is considered socially obnoxious, but it's a real question in the 2020s and the 2030s. Are they black women? Aren't we supposed to be getting beyond race? And there's a whole cadre of people who don't want to get beyond it. And frankly, I think it's because the sense of alienation and the sense of opposition to an other can be a sense of group membership. That's the funny thing about being a human under modern stratified conditions. You want somewhere to belong, and to be able to shake your fist at an outsider gives you a sense of warm tribalism. And I don't think that black people are exceptions to that because no humans are. But that means that you're not supposed to ask the question as to, isn't it time that we get beyond race? And of course, a person will say, but there's still racism out there. And then you ask, well, okay, but what kind? And nevertheless, why does it mean that we can't start getting beyond race and change our categories? Our categories are absurd, but there are people. It's getting to the point where I'm getting old. I'm 58. Thomas Chatterton Williams in his 30s, Coleman Hughes in his 20s. These are up and coming or up and came now, black commentators. and Camille Foster, who was in his 30s, they are rejecting the category completely, especially seeing, Thomas seeing his phenotypically white kids. I can't quite get there, but they're right. So I'm on the fence.
Yeah. Something else I was going to say, I can't remember what it was. Well, what about the defenestration of historical figures like David Hume, Lincoln, Jefferson? Could you say something about that?
Oh, yeah. The defenestration of people in the past is a galloping absurdity. I can't even pull punches on that. To pretend not to understand, and I really do think it's pretending. I'm not saying people don't understand. To pretend not to understand that it's very hard for people to see beyond their time, and or to insist that you do understand that, but when it comes to Black people and slavery, you don't, which makes no sense. To pretend that is a gesture. You're showing that you know racism exists by showing that you know that it existed, and that, of course, there are legacies of that racism then. But to evaluate Thomas Jefferson on the basis of how he saw Black people is willfully ahistorical. He was a great figure in so very many ways. And wow, big surprise. He thought Black people were inferior. Almost everyone did. The occasional person saw beyond it, but frankly, they rarely had a whole lot of influence in their view. It worries me in particular because based on that way of looking at things, almost anybody before about 10 minutes ago is somebody who you could barely get through dinner with now, including Martin Luther King and homophobia, all of it. And so what it means is it allows you to eschew history. You don't have to study history. And, big surprise, history is kind of difficult. History is a challenge. Well, if you are going to reject all of these people, you don't have to master how social history works. You don't have to learn all those old facts. You can just deal with the charisma of thinking about people who you think are cool today. It's pernicious for education. And honestly, I have no patience with it whatsoever. Now, there are degrees. So, for example, Woodrow Wilson, okay, he's white. He's Southern. He straddles the 19th and 20th century. Was he racist? Of course. But he was especially racist. He wrote poisonous things about Black people again and again, despite having a PhD, despite being president. I get why they took his name off of a building at Princeton, but it has to be an extreme case like that. It can't be just that you were white before last week. And that's where we're going.
It is remarkable if you look at history. If you look at, say, the 19th century, a figure like T.H. Huxley or Abraham Lincoln, who were in the vanguard of progressive thought at the time, and yet read what they say.
Right.
I mean, the hideous racism by modern standards.
They were progressive.
And they were progressive. And it makes you think about what people of the future, what in a century's time, are going to look back at us. And
no one thinks of that. I mean, for example, they're going to look at us and think that our sense of what white and Black are ridiculous. But, feelings about maybe abortion. Feelings about owning animals that may look appalling to people in the future. And the idea is we're going to, take somebody off of a building because they had a dog. That really is where we're going. It scares me. And it also I think we can do better. It's a problem.
Well, John, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you, and we better wrap up. I hope we can have another opportunity.
Richard, this was fantastic.
Other occasions.
I've wanted to meet you for 30 years, so this was great.
Many thanks.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can show some support by subscribing to the podcast, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a review.